Johannes Jaco Steyn is the Sunday rapist. Judge Sita Kolbe has found Steyn guilty of 33 of the 37 original charges against him. They include the kidnapping and murder of his last victim, Louise de Waal. In her judgment, Kolbe referred to Steyn as a self-confessed liar, but Steyn claims the whole truth did not come out.
Ek het nie veel om te sê nie. Ek het van tevore gesê ek judge nie. Ek sal nie iemand oordeel oor vir wat hulle gedoen het of so nie, want ek ken die omstandighede nie.
Maar mense het jou nog vandag geoordeel en hoe
Mense het my geoordeel.
So is jy nie jammer vir wat jy op aarde gedoen het nie? Maak dit nou nie saak nie.
Ek is 'n moeilike persoon in die sin van ek wys nie emosie nie. Ek sal nog steeds vir hulle wil jammer sê, ja. Daar's baie mense. Dit gaan klaar nou nie reg uitkom nie, want hulle gaan nou klaar sê, jy weet.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. Last week we spoke about the well-known ex-28 gang boss Ernest Solomon case, and he was murdered in broad daylight here in South Africa. And if you haven't seen that case, I will link it up here for you. But today we are going to talk about a case, and sadly, like many we have spoken about before on this channel, it shouldn't have gotten this far if police had just taken the seriousness of the crimes more seriously and actually punished the perpetrators with a stricter or harsher sentence, especially based on the crimes that they have done. And today's case is going to be difficult to listen to, and not only because of the vast amount of victims, but also what was done to the victims. And also at the fact that the perpetrator seemed quite proud of what he had done, and also that he thought that he was actually providing some enjoyment or pleasure to his victims. But with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today we are heading to the province of Gauteng, and we do not have a specific stop in mind because today's offender would be all over the place, preying on those he thought would be weak and vulnerable. Today's offender is a very sexual person, to put it mildly, and this obsession is one of the factors that drove him to do what he did. There are many other reasons, of course, but sex and the thrill of the chase was intoxicating to him. He was obsessed with sex and the feeling it gave him from a young age. Jaco Steyn would later be charged with 37 counts against his name, ranging mostly of rape, but this, horrifyingly, would escalate to murder and culpable homicide. These crimes would take place apparently from 2008 to 2011, and the girls who were the victims ranged from ages 11 to 18 years old. And sadly, the reason that Jaco Steyn was able to maneuver and get away from police for all these years was the fact that he would travel in different areas within the Gauteng province. And because Jaco was moving all the time, different police stations would get different victims coming to them, therefore never pinpointing an exact culprit because different police stations were getting different reports and they weren't able to put two and two together at the time. And sadly, that is why Jaco was able to commit so many crimes in such abundance. But the great work and determination of the police officers would ultimately be able to bring Jaco Steyn behind bars. So with that massive intro, let's get into some of the crimes that Jaco Steyn committed. And one cannot really understand the mind of such a serial offender. But Jaco's thoughts were so odd, and he would veer into one direction of where we think a serial offender of this type would go, but he would completely maneuver and change his tactics to try and get police off his tail. But let's start. The first reported incident occurred in November of 2008. And we say reported because we do know that many things can cause victims to be afraid or ashamed and maybe not come forward. And especially with the age of Jaco's victims, they were very young. And that may also be a reason that some girls may have not come forward. But the first occurrence in November of 2008, it seems that Jaco may have been dipping his toe in the sea of possibilities. However, with the first incident in 2008, this incident only involved kidnapping, and we say only involved because his crimes would escalate quite drastically near the end before he got caught. And it seems like the first incident that was reported, it seems like Jaco was kind of dipping his toe into the possibilities of what he was able to do and what crimes he would be able to commit and get away with. But on this day, in November 2011, An 11-year-old girl would be walking home from school when a man with a white bakkie then pulled up beside her. This man got out of the vehicle, running up to her with the gun pointed at her head, and he was wearing a disguise. This man then told her to get inside of the bakkie or he will kill her, and she described him as a white man with a dark wig on and with large glasses. It seems as though the man who placed this 11-year-old girl into his vehicle then drove around a little bit and then let her go as far as we know. The next crime to take place would take place only 7 months later, on the 22nd of June, 2009, and a 15-year-old girl who was also walking in the area of Rustenburg. I forgot to mention the first 11-year-old was in the area of Rustenburg, and so was the second victim. So the 15-year-old girl was walking on the pavement in Rustenburg when a white bakkie then came screaming up next to her, and out then ran a man with a gun pointed right at her face. This man then forces this 15-year-old into his vehicle when he then takes her and he drives quite a distance away. The two then drive to a remote veld or a remote field where he then rapes her. He then tells her to take her shoes off when he then gets up once he's done and he leaves her. Then, on the 2nd of November 2009, a 12-year-old girl who was also walking on the pavement in her area, she was abducted in Potchefstroom, which is a little way away from Rustenburg. And this girl who was also walking on the pavement heard a bakkie come screaming up right next to her. Man then came out running towards her with a gun then pointed at her head, and he then told her to also get into the bakkie, where he then also drove her to a faraway field or veld, where he then her as well. Then 4 months would then go on to the 14th of February 2010, where a young girl who was walking in Vandervale Park was also walking on the pavement before she then heard a car pull up right next to her. This young girl was 16 years old at the time. She was kidnapped in the same way as the other young girls, also taken to a field and also raped. All of these girls were let go, but it was these next few attacks where the nickname the Sunday Sinner would then come into play, which it was for some reason that we will actually get into later as to why he was called the Sunday Sinner. And it's because his crimes would then occur on Sundays from 2010 onwards, but this would also prove to be inaccurate because eventually he would just do it on any day. But quite a few of his crimes took place on Sundays, and like I said, we'll get into it later as to why. But back to the crimes. And then on the 7th of March 2010 in Rustenburg again, a 16-year-old girl was taken in the same way as the others were. But then something started to change. And it may be that maybe this man thought that he had a lot more power over his victims, or that he knew exactly what he was looking for and he knew exactly what to expect now. We don't know. But something started to change in the way that he would now talk to his victims and what he would do to them. Once they were inside the bakkie and they were being driven and taken to the field where they would ultimately be raped, before they would be attacked, he would want them to drink a lot. He would also then talk to his victims and tell them how good they look, how good their body looks, how good their hair looks, how good their legs look. He was basically flirting with them in order to make them feel good, even though they were completely there against their will, absolutely frightened because there was a gun pointed at their head majority of the time. But there was almost a sense of creepy element. Even though his crimes were creepy before, he was now almost trying to make them feel good about themselves in a weird and really unwanted way, even though, like we said, they were there by force. But it seems like he's obviously enjoying this type of fantasy that he has in his head, that he's helping them enjoy themselves too. But I digress, and the crimes continued. And then on the 4th of August 2010, also in Potchefstroom, a young 18-year-old girl was also walking down the pavement when a bakkie then pulled up right next to her. The man then came out of the car and tried to pull her into the vehicle, but she managed to escape, and then she reported this to police. But then things went absolutely and massively pear-shaped on the 5th of September 2010. Two young girls were walking around when 14-year-old Lizanne Farmer and her 16-year-old friend were in Armstrong Lane in Pretoria, when, you guessed it, a bakkie then came screaming up right next to the two girls, and a man then came running out of the driver's seat and then pointed a gun at both the girls' faces. Lizanne's friend would then describe the man as a white male with a wig and big glasses on. He then forced both girls into the back of the bakkie and he told them to duck their heads so that no one in the area would see them being kidnapped. Lazan's friend would then recall that Lazan, once they were in the bakkie, she then put her hand on her friend's hand and they then held hands for a little while, and this man who had kidnapped them was then driving faster and faster down the freeway. Lazan's friend then described that once they were at quite a speed, Lazan then looked at her friend and then, with her other hand, opened the door of the bakkie, where she then flung herself out of the bakkie at a very, very fast speed. And Lazan's friend thought that she would be alright. She looked like she was injured, but she had this hope that maybe she would be able to get up and get help. But sadly, when Lazan flung herself out of the vehicle, she hit the ground with such a force that it actually broke her neck on impact and she died on the road. She would be found later by a passerby, but sadly, she was already dead. And one of the disturbing things that Lazan's friend would actually describe was that this man who was driving didn't even flinch when she flung herself out of the vehicle. He just told Lazan's friend to just close the door, and then he kind of muttered to himself, "Oh, I kind of thought that we were going to have a threesome." But then he just continued to drive, and he just continued to put foot and speed away. Sadly for Lazan's friend, she was taken to a field in the middle of nowhere where she was forced to drink a lot of alcohol, and then when she became quite ill, she was then raped. Then on the 19th of September 2010, in an area called Coltonville, a 15-year-old girl was abducted in the same way as the others were. She was then taken to a field as well where she was raped, and then she was released. Then, on the 31st of October 2010, the youngest of all of his victims was then also walking on the side of the road when she was then abducted by a man in a wig with glasses on, taken into the back of the bakkie, and then taken to a remote area or veld where she was then also raped. And she was only 11 years old at the time. The 11-year-old victim is kind of where this perpetrator's downfall started to take place, because the young 11-year-old girl was brave enough to go and talk to police and report the crime, obviously with her parents still with her. But this was in Krugersdorp, and she was then asked to go to Krugersdorp police station, where she was then asked to speak to Captain Piet du Toit. Because of the victim's age, Captain Piet du Toit put everything else aside and started working on this case. And even though the 11-year-old girl went through an absolutely horrendous and traumatic event, Captain du Toit really wanted to hone in on her memories as soon as he could. So when he was allowed to do so, he then tried to speak to this young girl. She was obviously incredibly scared, but incredibly brave. And the 11-year-old then told Captain du Toit that he was a white man with a wig on and glasses, and he drove a white bakkie. The detective then got out some photos of different bakkies that we have here in South Africa, and she then pointed out the one that looked exactly like the perpetrator's bakkie. He was driving a white Mitsubishi Pajero. So police now had a car, they kind of had a perpetrator, and even though Captain du Toit knew that because he was wearing a wig and big glasses, it was very unlikely that they were going to have an accurate sketch of the person. However, Captain du Toit still wanted this young 11-year-old girl to go to one of the best sketch artists in South Africa to get some kind of sketch done by her. So when the young girl was done with her sketch, the artist then called Captain du Toit and said, you won't believe it, I finished the drawing. However, I just got a call from the Coltonville area with almost the exact same perpetrator. So Detective du Toit now knew that this perpetrator was most likely operating in many areas, and so he now tried to gather as many dockets as he could with similar circumstances with regards to a man in a wig and with a man with glasses on in a white bakkie. And he managed to now get 8 different dockets, and he now started combing through all of the dockets. Sadly, none of the cases in any of the dockets had any DNA evidence, because when Detective du Toit read through the dockets, he realized that this man was very careful. This man who was attacking these young girls either wore a condom, or he used a foreign object like a dildo or something else that he found. If he didn't use any of these, he would then try oral sex. And the reason why there was no DNA in any of the mouths of the young girls was because he would either make them wash their mouths out with alcohol, he would make them spit everything out, or he would then take the wet wipes that he had in his bakkie and make them wipe out their entire mouth with this wet wipe. And remember, we are talking about 11-year-olds to 18-year-olds, and it is absolutely disgusting what these young girls had to go through. And Captain du Toit and the Krugersdorp police station was quite busy at the time, so Captain du Toit basically had to work on this case himself, which took a long time, but he was very diligent, and he basically went to all of the victims. He tried to speak to them if and when they were able to, and he also then went to every location that the victims pointed out, and he mapped the GPS coordinates of all of these different areas. And while talking to these victims, he noticed that the perpetrator was taking mementos of his crimes, and basically he was either taking shoes, hair accessories, or pieces of clothing like their underwear. But now that the detectives and the police were on the perpetrator's case, they started to talk to the news agencies, and the news agencies then spread the word about the possible perpetrator, what vehicle he was driving, and obviously the perpetrator then got wind that they were on his back. So what the perpetrator did is he tried not to commit any crimes until he was not able to anymore. So he then waited until July 2011 to commit his next crime. And a young girl was walking on the pavement in Potchefstroom, and she was almost taken and abducted and put into a silver double cab bakkie, but the man then failed to grab her and then he quickly sped off. She did not initially report this to police, but luckily a neighbor who overheard the conversation while the parents were talking to the neighbor, she then went to police and then reported that there had now been this incident. Police then looked at this and they thought, okay, this is a man in a wig with glasses on, but now he's driving a silver double cab bakkie. So Captain du Toit was now notified that there was a change in vehicle, and now he was no longer using the white vehicle, he was now using a silver vehicle. But then on Wednesday the 12th of October 2011, this man then struck again. In Roodepoort, a young 16-year-old female named Louise Duval stayed with her mom. Louise would walk to school with her friend every day, and Louise was very close to her mom and a very kind young lady. On the 12th of October, Louise got up from school like normal and headed out the door and walked with her friend to school. But as they were on their way, around less than a kilometer away from school, Louise then noticed that she forgot to put cream on her legs. So Louise and her friend then stopped, and Louise then put her bag down. She was grabbing cream out of her bag and then started to put cream on her legs when all of a sudden a silver double cab bakkie then pulled up next to the young girls. Louise's friend actually thought that this man may ask for directions, and they didn't expect this man to come running out of the driver's seat with a gun pointed at their faces. Initially, the man wanted both girls into the bakkie, but because there were two of them, he couldn't maneuver with both, so he then forced Louise to get into the back of the bakkie, and Louise was unable to get out because he locked the back. He then ran back into the driver's seat, where he then sped off. Louise's friend then ran immediately to Louise's house. She then banged on the door to notify Louise's mom that this had all happened. Louise's mom initially didn't really believe it. She thought that she was maybe playing a prank on her, but the seriousness of her voice really frightened Louise's mom. They immediately then went to the police station and reported Louise Duval as missing. Within minutes, police were on the ground with a bolo for the vehicle, and they were trying to look for Louise. Sadly, hours passed, and eventually a horrific discovery would come to light. At 10:55 the same morning, a farmer near the area of Magaliesburg noticed a small smoky patch at the end of his property. He was worried that the smoke would then come into his farm and eventually cause devastation, so he quickly got into his vehicle and drove towards the smoky area. Once the farmer got there, he then noticed as he got closer, and once he put out a lot of the flames, that he thought that he was looking at a burnt body of an animal. But as he got even closer, he then noticed horrifically that it was a human being. Police were then called, and quickly they then surrounded the area, and now they were trying to find out who this person could be. The body was so badly burnt that there was no distinguishing factors anywhere that they could make out who she was, how old she was, but they did know it was a female and that she had earrings in and that she also had a belly button ring. So the Magaliesburg area, or the police who worked in that area, they then decided to look through their missing people first to see if this is any of them. They found none that really matched the description, so they then called around to areas close to their area. They eventually got hold of Captain du Toit, who said yes, they are looking for a young female, and then the police in Magaliesburg said, oh, does she have a belly button ring? Captain du Toit was not told about this, so he then phoned up Louise's mom, who said yes, she does have a belly button ring. So Captain du Toit then went to Magaliesburg. He then got the belly button ring inside a plastic bag. He then took it back to Louise's mom, who then identified it positively as Louise's belly button ring. And sadly, that is how she found out that her daughter had passed away. So now Captain du Toit knew not only was he looking for a serial rapist, but also now a murderer. Months went on, and eventually an anonymous caller actually called into police and said they wanted to speak to Captain du Toit. This person then said that a man that they knew was acting very suspiciously, and that they knew that he was previously convicted of kidnapping, and that he lived in the Roodepoort area. He was 33 years old and his name was Jaco Steyn. Johannes Jacobus Steyn was 33 years old and he was married with a young child. He was a white male whose profession was carpentry. Jaco was a Seventh-day Adventist, and most people described him as kind, helpful, and very timid. He was never ever seen to be aggressive. Jaco had a police record, and he was arrested previously for abduction and sexual assault of young girls. Also, as a side note, Jaco Steyn was also a youth helper within his church of Seventh-day Adventists, so he worked with children every Sunday. And also, remember in the beginning I said that the reason that he was known as the Sunday Sinner would later come to light? Well, you won't actually believe this, but remember Jaco, I said earlier, had a conviction, a police record based on child abduction and sexual assault. Well, he was convicted and then sent to community service, and the community service that Jaco would have to do was to work at a hospital and clean the toilets or just clean the areas in the rooms. But Jaco would often not go, and he would barely go, and once he noticed that people actually didn't notice whether he was there or not, he would then, on Sundays, go out and abduct, rape, and eventually he would murder a child. So how hectic is it that when he committed his crimes, he was supposed to be cleaning the hospital and doing community service for his previous crimes? And here we have an obvious case where police did not take the crimes of a person seriously, and now it escalated to an even worse crime or crimes. So when police found this all out, that he was supposed to be a community service, he was also convicted of another crime, Captain du Toit then went straight to his home, and when they got to his home, they then knocked on the door. Nobody was there, so Captain du Toit is kind of looking around, and he notices on the side is a silver double cab bakkie. So Captain du Toit then walks up to the bakkie, and he notices that there's a black bag in the back of the bakkie. So he then opens this black bag, and what he notices inside is Louise van der Waals' school bag. Captain du Toit then also looks at the bin that's on the pavement of Jaco's house, and he then notices that inside there is a SIM card. He then takes the SIM card, and eventually it would be found that that is actually Louise's SIM card. So soon after Captain du Toit found Louise's school bag in the back of Jaco's bakkie, the place was absolutely surrounded by police. And when police were surrounding Jaco's house, he actually turned the corner and noticed that there were police at his house. So he then drove away, and he called his wife to say that he's not coming home, I've done something bad, I'm gonna go missing, basically. Inside the house, they did find DNA evidence that Louise was inside the home, but it seems like she may have been knocked unconscious because she was then put into the back of his bakkie, where she was then driven to this remote area and then set alight. And sadly, later, the forensic pathologists would find that she was actually alive when she was burnt because she had smoke inhalation and also bits of soot inside her lungs. There was a massive manhunt now to find Jaco Steyn, and his cell phone records were being looked at as well. Apparently, Jaco was able to get in touch with Captain du Toit. He then called him to tell him that he wanted to take his own life. Captain du Toit then tried to talk him out of it, and for hours they spoke. And eventually, Captain du Toit was able to convince Jaco Steyn, the man he had been hunting for years, to hand himself into the nearest police station. Jaco then did hand himself in, and he was then arrested and taken into custody. Jaco Steyn was taken into court in October of 2011. He was happy and the biggest character in court. Jaco pleaded not guilty for the 37 charges placed against his name. The official trial started in 2012. The damning evidence in the case against Jaco Steyn was actually the GPS coordinates that Captain du Toit first got hold of when he was first investigating the case. And then on the 18th of September 2012, Jaco Steyn was found guilty of 33 of the 37 charges placed against him. He was found guilty for the murder of Louise and also found guilty of culpable homicide for the murder of Lazan. Johannes Jacobus Steyn was found guilty and sentenced to 5 life sentences plus 170 years. And Jaco Steyn is now in Pretoria's C-Max prison. And wow, what a case. Let me know what you think of this case down below. It is a very difficult case to swallow, and I do think that police try hard in a lot of circumstances, but the systems past their control sometimes do fail us. Like, why would they let a perpetrator out known for doing these things and then not give anyone any warning to what he has done and then still allow him to be with children every single week? Why is there no follow-up from the courts? Why is there no follow-up from the system? And also, when he was sent to do community service, no one even checked that he was was there. And that's why he was able to commit these crimes. And that's why he always had an alibi, according to his wife, because he was supposed to be at the hospital. She knew nothing different, but she did divorce him in the end, by the way. But she knew nothing different, and she really thought that he was at the hospital cleaning. So when they accused him of these crimes happening on Sundays, she really thought that he had nothing to do with it because he was supposed to be at the hospital. But let me know what you think of this case down below. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend further. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.